Hey everyone, welcome back to Horsetooth Cinema. Today I'm going to finally be reviewing Infinity Pool, which is the new film by Brandon Cronenberg. I think Brandon Cronenberg is a really interesting filmmaker. I still haven't seen Antiviral, but his second feature, Possessor, I found to be a really interesting piece of work, and it's probably in my top 3 movies of 2020. He, of course, loves body horror like his dad does, but he seems to me to have much more of a mind-focused approach compared to his dad. His new film is about a man named James, played by Alexander Skarsgård, who goes on vacation with his wife to a resort in Croatia. Once there, they meet a seductive and mysterious young woman, and they find themselves in a culture filled with violence, hedonism, and untold horror. A tragic accident eventually leaves them facing a zero-tolerance policy towards crime, where the penalty is either you'll be executed, or if you're rich enough to afford it, you can clone yourself and watch yourself die instead. Okay, before I get into the review, this has to just be said by somebody. Mia Goth is in an absurd amount of movies with a certain bodily fluid in them. It's getting a little bit weird, to be honest. I'm gonna start by stating the obvious, that this movie is not for everyone. Far from it. Like Cronenberg Jr.'s last couple of films, I think that this is made for fans of extreme horror, but I think even more so than his last movie, Infinity Pool is going to be divisive amongst fans, even of fans of extreme horror. So for example, I saw it with my friend Cole, who is a filmmaker himself, and he's really into extreme horror, David Lynch in particular, and he's interested in the way that that genre can sort of push the boundaries of cinema. And when we got out of the theater, he thought it was a bit meh. I think that says right off the bat that even amongst people who like this sort of out there, weird, very extreme horror, it will be divisive even amongst them. I think I like it more than he does, but I still think it's a very flawed movie. I want to start off by, talking about what I liked about the film first. And, one thing is that, again, is like Possessor, this is another example of Cronenberg Jr. picking up where his father left off of the body horror genre, and how sort of that ties in with ideas relating to identity. Like Possessor, this is in many ways a movie about the mind losing a battle for its own identity. And Infinity Pool, in many ways, is just as weird and trippy as Possessor. It has a lot of those same sort of droning, mind-bending sequences. There are even scenes in Possessor where the main character, played by Alexander Skarsgård, gets drugged with psychedelics, and the sequence that follows is something that I maybe previously thought only Gaspar Noé could come up with, but it was really something to see in a theater. Another thing I really like about it is that it's a very effective and interesting satire on the rich. Which is something that's been a little bit overplayed, I think, lately. I think that we all have sort of noticed this trend of rich people vacation satires. I'm thinking of stuff like The Menu and Triangle of Sadness, Glass Onion. But compared to, I haven't seen Triangle of Sadness yet, but I've seen the other two. And compared to those movies, I found this one to be much more thorough and well thought out in its execution. For a movie that is, on paper, just in terms of the plot, another stab at this sort of overplayed rich people vacation satire, this one I found to be shockingly psychologically engaged with its protagonist, despite the fact that the film still has a pretty negative view of him. Mild spoilers for this part. I mean, this I did mention this kind of in the description of the movie. It's not exactly a huge spoiler, but midway through the film, James, the main character, is driving back with his drunken friends to the hotel from a day at the beach, and on the way there, they hit and kill somebody with their car. Eventually, he's arrested for this, and he's given a choice by the government to either be executed or to undergo a procedure where he would be cloned, and then he watches the clone get executed. So he goes through this, and it's a very brutal sequence, obviously, very hard for this character to watch, but at the same time, he's sort of fascinated by it. And with this fascination, he decides to stay at the hotel longer, and he becomes more and more infatuated by the sort of depraved culture going on at the hotel. And it becomes clearer and clearer to me that the longer he stays there and the deeper he gets into this sort of rabbit hole, this cult, this depravity starts to wear away at his own mind. And you start to wonder, the more you watch the film, did the government even kill the clone in the first place? Or did they kill the real James? And is the person that we're watching now just one of the clones from down the sequence? And to me, this is just a really farcically cruel way of satirizing the way rich people treat developing countries in which they vacation. I mean, while abroad, I've certainly seen, you know, behavior like this in developed countries for sure. Maybe not to the extent of what it is in the film, but certainly, you know, rich people treating poor countries like their playgrounds. They're extremely reckless to the point of harm for the population, but it's okay for them because ultimately they can just buy their way out of whatever consequences come from it. And I really like that it's, you know, that in that way the satire is mean-spirited towards its rich characters, but at the same time, it's also really refreshing to see one of these satires have some sympathy and really identify in the headspace of which the character is clearly in. Because as the film goes along, you know, James becomes so fascinated by this procedure that he decides to go through it over and over again, and committing, you know, more heinous crimes in order to do so. And we realize that, you know, yes, James has done shitty things, but it's also because he's been doing them because he's been dragged into doing them by this cult, who, as we sort of find out throughout the film, especially Mia Goth's character, they view him in a very pathetic way, and they're kind of just using him. And as we see this sort of eat away at his identity, especially as we realize that it's not really entirely his fault, we definitely do sympathize with him. So it's not just like one of these, like, you know, Glass Onion type of rich people satires that just basically views them as robots, to which they can create the most overly simple generalizations about them. It does sort of, I mean, it's definitely views them as shitty people, but also with nuances that we can sympathize with. And speaking of the cult, this is another really, really good Mia Goth performance. I don't think her capabilities as an actress are used here quite as well as they are in Pearl. That film, I think, really brings out that Sissy Spacek quality that she has of, you know, bringing sympathy to a flawed but very, you know, painful character. Here, she's really just playing an awful, awful person, but she really gets to chew the scenery every chance she gets. One thing I also noticed while watching this is I thought a lot about Stanley Kubrick movies. I think that Cronenberg is certainly using a few movies in particular as reference points for this. I thought this was sort of like a mindfuck, you know, extreme horror amalgamation of like The Shining, where you have the sort of hotel element and the idea of like these, you know, characters are becoming part of the hotel, they're part of the culture. You have a little bit of Clockwork Orange, where you sort of have this cult of violence juxtaposed against authoritarian government. And at the same time, you also have something like Eyes Wide Shut, which focuses on this sort of psychosexual journey into this character's own mind. And I do think actually that Cronenberg is pulling from these movies and using his references in a pretty thoughtful way, to the point where I don't even think everybody who watches the film is necessarily going to pick up on all of that. But it is definitely like a knowing reference, and I think it also affects the way he shoots the film. This definitely, like Possessor, has kind of a cold style to it, a little bit. Though we are, you know, literally immersing ourselves in the character's mind, sometimes the way that the camera moves does feel a bit removed. My big criticism of this film is that, unlike David Cronenberg, Brandon's father, I think Brandon Cronenberg is a little bit unfocused with his films. Watching a David Cronenberg movie, to me, especially a really good one, feels like a much more cohesive experience than watching either this movie or something like Possessor. You watch something like The Fly, for example, and that film certainly has a lot of different ideas going on, but it definitely feels like there is a glue that holds the film together around this, the struggle of this central character. And I guess Infinity Pool sort of does too. It is a satire about the way that wealth erodes at your own identity, but that central glue has so many different branches that to me just go off into very far out there, unfocused directions that it can be very hard to connect to the central idea that the film has. But I do see value in cinema that, you know, after your first viewing, you can't even begin to put some of the pieces together. And even if on your sixth viewing, ideas still remain a bit underdeveloped, despite the film, what it's saying becomes a bit clearer. I still see value in that because, especially with someone like Cronenberg, he's tapping into the unconscious mind and to body horror in such a visceral way that for me, as a fan of extreme horror, I can still get a lot out of it. It's also just a really fun midnight movie. Like, it's just, it has a lot of scenes that are genuinely shocking to the point where it would be a lot of fun to see with like a packed crowd at a really late showing. So one of the reasons that it took me a while to review this movie is that I was still kind of reviewing it in my own head for a while. I was kind of wrestling with whether to give this a 3 or a 4. I think I'm gonna go with the 4. But it's kind of a lighter 4. I like Skinamarink and Knock at the Cabin better as movies this year. I just think that the ideas in the film, because they're a little bit muddled, the film hasn't stuck with me that much since I've seen it. But returning to it and really thinking about it in retrospect, I do think it's a pretty strong piece of work, especially as a very extreme horror version of like a rich people satire. So it's a lot of fun. I highly recommend going to see it if it's still playing near you. And yeah, that's gonna do it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, you can like it down below and subscribe to the channel if you want. I've got more videos coming out soon. I want to be catching up with some Oscar sort of movies soon, maybe stuff like EO or Women Talking or something like that. So I'll see what I can review for you guys here in the future. I'm also going to be appearing on a podcast soon for the channel Did You See That? He's doing a live stream this Thursday at, I believe, I'll be appearing on it at 8 p.m. UK time. So if you want to check that out, please do. And yeah, so I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya.